Thanks very much for asking me to do this. It was really fun. And I'd like to start with a big thank you to my co-editors, Claire Balboni, who is at MIT, and Shweta Bhole, who's a postdoc at JPAL. I'd also like to say thank you to Professor Deepak Garg, who is at the University of California, San Diego, who gave us some comments as we were working through this. All right, so let me start with a bit of broad motivation about the challenges that developing countries face, even in absence of the challenge of climate change. And so developing countries face the very significant challenge of poverty reduction, as well as now of climate change adaptation. And when we even examine just the first part of that, from 1990 to about 2015, there was a lot of progress on poverty reduction goals. The global extreme poverty rate fell and more than 1 billion people escaped poverty. However, since then, progress has been slower and in some years reversing. And the pandemic is partly to blame for this, but not a lot. And the reason why I bring this up when I'm motivating the literature on climate change adaptation in developing countries is that, as you'll see, income tends to be a pretty big factor in determining the level of adaptive resources that are available and therefore the impacts of. And of course, for some countries, there's a triple challenge for fast-growing large developing economies. They have to combine the challenges of poverty reduction and climate change adaptation with those of mitigation as well. But why do we think developing countries are different necessarily than developed countries when it comes to climate change adaptation? This is for a variety of reasons. First, if you just look at the data, and I'll talk a little bit about this in more detail in a few minutes, if you just look at the data, the impacts of things like heat waves and weather shocks and rainfall shocks are greater on developing countries. So this includes important outcomes like output per capita, GDP, economic growth. Those effects are larger in developing countries, and also outcomes like mortality in hotter years and drier years. These impacts are larger for poorer countries. They have long coastlines, which increase vulnerability to extreme events. They also have large populations, so I'll go over that in a little while. The fact that they have lower incomes means that that can have implications for resilience to these shocks. And developing countries, on average, have lower access to social safety. And then, usually, on average temperatures are higher in developing countries, which means that further warming will increase this vulnerability. So let me just show you, what one aspect of this vulnerability might look like. So this picture is from an IMF study, but other scholars have found very similar effects doing very similar analyses. And what this is showing you, the colors represent the effects of a 1 degree hotter year on GDP or output per capita, right? And so this is just showing you what happens to incomes when there are hotter years. And the reasons why the sizes of the countries are a little bit different from what you would expect is that these are weighted by the population of that country. So the green here shows places where hotter years have, if anything, positive effects. And the red ones with the shading of increasingly red, the worst effects of a hotter year. So we see that India is quite adversely affected, for instance, and also has a large share of population. And so this shows you that developing countries on average fare worse in hotter years, and also that many people live there. And in fact, if you look at population projections, currently about 60% of the world's population lives in these red places which have a negative impact of temperature shock. By 2100, 3/4 of the world's population is projected to live there. So even if we do the best we can in terms of restricting climate change to 2 degrees Celsius, it looks like a considerable level of adaptation is required to take care of these negative effects. And so essentially, as I said, this is a review on the economics of climate adaptation in developing countries. We're going to use...
Sorry, Namrata, I'm just going to interrupt. I think a couple of people have mentioned that your slides look too zoomed in and might not be changing. So maybe if you just unshare your screen and reshare it, that might solve that. I'm not sure exactly what's gone on there because it looked fine to me. But
oh, interesting. Sure. Moving now.
they are for me. So if anyone could let us know if those issues are still happening, and then we can just jump back in if that seems to be solved.
Okay, so as long as they're moving, I might want to move on. Perhaps it's a cell phone viewing issue. To be honest, I'm not sure that they're moving on my screen and if they're moving on yours.
Yeah, I think we'll, yeah. I'm sorry if people have issues with that, but yeah, it seems to be somewhat solved. So
I mean,
sorry for interrupting.
No worries. I'm also happy to just try once more, since that resolved one of the issues.
Yeah.
I see. Okay.
Great. That looks good to me. I think someone said that they had this issue on the browser, but not in the Zoom app. So I'm not sure if it's something that we can do anything about. So yeah, sorry for interrupting again. And yeah, carry on.
Great. And so, the literature review has three parts, and I should have mentioned this from the get-go, but VoxDev literatures are typically sort of living, breathing literatures, and so we anticipate updating this quite frequently, and we're particularly anxious for your feedback. But so far, the review has essentially three parts. The first part is quantifying vulnerabilities to weather and climate on economic outcomes that economists care a lot about, like income, mortality, human capital attainment, productivity, crime and violence, etc. And what I'll show you is that there's a lot of excellent work that shows very sobering effects of weather shocks and climate shocks on these very important economic outcomes in ways that are sometimes pretty sobering also for equity reasons. The second part of the literature talks about various adaptation behaviors that people take, that firms take, and that policies can facilitate. And so the first part of the literature really sets up the importance for policies. And what I'll show you is that so far, a lot of the focus that tests how policies have helped adaptation have largely been policies which don't have climate change adaptation as a particular goal, but because income tends to be a pretty important reason why weather and climate affects these economic outcomes, have been able to help with adaptation. And so I think this opens up important questions for how things like climate change adaptation financing should be targeted. And then finally, quite quickly, if I have time, but we have a whole section of the literature on this, is I'll review some recent work on spatial linkages, which talk about the fact that a climate shock or a weather shock in one place may not stay in that place because it can propagate to other regions. People might migrate to get away from the shock. It might propagate via supply chain network from firm linkages. And that, again, has important implications for the types of policies that we might undertake for adaptation. Great. And so essentially, we have four findings from the literature. The first is, as I said before, the effects of climate shocks and weather shocks tend to be large. They're pretty large for households, firms, and at the level of countries. They're adverse for outcomes that are really very important, like income, conflict, human capital formation, productivity, mortality, and so on. And then finally, even though I'll show you that households, farmers, and firms undertake adaptation along a variety of measures, these are seldom able to mitigate these effects completely. And that really sets up the role, I think, for policies to facilitate adaptation, showing that they will have large welfare gains. These effects also, in some cases, last for decades, and as I said before, spread across space. And so, as I already told you, I'll talk a little bit about the work on spatial linkages and how these shocks propagate. And then finally, socioeconomic policies, even if they are not targeted explicitly towards climate change financing, they can minimize frictions to adaptation by helping incomes, by helping educational attainment. And then, although political economy may be a concern for the implementation of these policies. So without further ado, let me move on to the first part of this, which is just how do we measure the impacts of climate change and weather shocks. Before I do that, I just want to highlight what are the methods that most of the studies that I'm going to review rely on. And so the earliest studies in the economics of climate and climate change relied on essentially comparing regions or counties or districts which have warmer average temperatures with less warm average temperatures and similar for rainfall characteristics. And the rationale behind doing that is that because climate is essentially a long-term weather parameter, this is perhaps the closest that we can get to measuring what climate actually does. An issue with this literature that is perhaps quite concerning is that causality becomes difficult to attribute, because if we're looking at regions that are warmer on average over many decades, they may have other omitted variables like different governance, which makes interpreting the effects of climate as a causal effect quite difficult. And so what I'm going to talk about next is largely going to be studies that rely on the effects of short-run changes to weather. So that can be a hotter year, a drought, an extreme event like hurricane landfall. And what most of these studies do is to take these parameters, which are causal effects of a hotter year or a drought, and try to extrapolate that to a future climate scenario. And so I think in terms of future work, understanding better the implications of these extrapolations would be quite interesting and policy relevant. But just so you know what you're getting for the rest of this talk, I'm going to rely on studies that are focusing on the short run, in some cases decadal, but not just the pure cross-sectional effects. And when we do that, what we see is that warmer years and rainfall shocks, I'll talk a little bit about extreme events in a couple of slides. Essentially, warmer years and rainfall shocks adversely affect a broad range of outcomes. So as I already showed you in the picture on slide 2, they affect GDP per capita. These effects are greater in developing countries, which is also where most of the people live. Not only do they affect GDP per capita, they also affect the growth of GDP. And so that has implications for escaping poverty for developing countries. They affect mortality, and so these effects are also larger in developing countries. So the Caruso and Spears study essentially looks at data on 53 developing countries and finds that the estimates of temperature on mortality, the magnitude of those, look not too dissimilar from the US before the rollout of air conditioning. And so the effects are pretty disparate across space currently in a way that's focused heavily against developing countries. There's also work that shows that temperature shocks and rainfall shocks affect several different types of crime and violence. So what I've cited here is a review of this literature in ways that can have implications for equity. So there's also work that shows that gender-based violence in particular is affected by warm years and rainfall shocks. And so this is sort of saying that broadly speaking, economic growth, income, mortality, and crime are affected by these parameters. More honing down to what are the different possible mechanisms, well, these years are typically worse for agriculture. And so they affect crop yields, agricultural productivity, and agricultural incomes. They can also affect parameters like educational attainment for children and the presence of child labor. And the link between educational attainment for children and weather operates largely via income, but not exclusively. And the link between child labor and warmer years and rainfall shocks is mediated by the fact that these years might be differential for income, which might affect the opportunity cost of children working on the farm, which means that parents may pull children out of school to work on the farm, or conversely, may do the opposite. And then to go back to some of the mechanisms behind the impact of GDP per capita and weather shocks. So I already told you that these are years that are worse for crop yields and agricultural outcomes. These are also years that adversely affect worker productivity. And they affect this not only for blue collar occupations, but also for white collar occupations. And more broadly, if you look at country level panel data sets like the Zheng et al. Paper does for say China, they find that both capital intensive and labor intensive firms have productivity that is hurt by temperature shocks. It also affects which sectors workers work in. So in some cases, temperature shocks can induce workers to switch from agriculture to manufacturing. And so there's a lot of well done microeconomics evidence that now underpins, if you will, the mechanisms for the macroeconomic effects that we find at the country level or at a broad regional level. The one other thing that I think is worth mentioning is that these impacts may be short-lived, but in some instances, they can last for decades. So the paper that I have here from 2009 talks about how rainfall shocks in the Philippines that happen during early childhood can affect adult wages. And that's because, as I said before, they affect things like how much education people get, how much parents are able to spend time with children, and so on. So not only are these effects large, significant for important outcomes, they are in some instances also quite long-lived, which then really, I think, sets up the role for policy in trying to mitigate them. The other thing that I'd like to point out is that income is often a primary mechanism for why, say, we see educational attainment being affected by weather shocks. In some instances, it's not the primary mechanism. And so I think for future work, understanding what other mechanisms are at play can be quite policy relevant. So in terms of impacts, natural disasters are also a pretty big factor in affecting outcomes. And if you look at just where natural disasters happen, this is from the MDAT data, we see that in some instances, developing countries have more, but it really doesn't seem like there's a big correlation. So for example, the US has a lot of natural disasters, just the global occurrence. But then if you look at where the people are who are affected by natural disasters, this does seem to be affected somewhat by the development process, and that's just because more people live in developing countries. So what does the literature say about the impacts of short-run and long-run effects of disasters on things like income and child health? So more important, as I said, lots of people live in developing countries and they have large adverse consequences. The focus of the literature here has largely been in terms of extreme events and cyclones, hurricanes, and typhoons. But some of the literature that I cited 2 or 3 slides ago also looks at the impacts of droughts. And so at the macro level, what disasters do can reduce economic growth for both rich and poor countries. And once again, what stands out is the fact that these effects are quite persistently negative and last for quite a long time. They affect child health. They also affect the rate of healthcare seeking for children. And they affect income and local economic activity as measured by night lights. And so essentially, they affect income growth. The effects are quite negative, and they also affect child health. They affect firm sales and survival. And so this is a study that looks at data from India and finds that not only are firms negatively affected by natural disasters, the effects are quite heterogeneous across firms. And then it talks about how firms try to adapt by changing the product mix of what they produce. Now, one study that I'd like to particularly highlight here is a study that looks at the effects of extreme events for a variety of different countries. And what's, I think, quite interesting about this is that it shows that the impacts on educational attainment, in this case, which is their primary outcome, vary by the type of the disaster, how exposed people were to the disaster, as well as where they were when the disaster occurred. And I think that's important as we, as economists, go and try to measure effects and then try to extrapolate them and raise policy implications, because I think for future work, trying to understand what is our ability to extrapolate impacts from one place to another is particularly important. So that's the overview of the section that talks about the impacts of climate change. What about adaptation? And so what are the different types of adaptation that can occur? Well, adaptation can be at the individual or the firm level. And broadly, the way that we think about this is that these adaptations can be financial, like credit and insurance. They can be technology adoption and practices. And I'll talk a little bit about how, even though technologies hold a lot of promise in increasing adaptive capacity, the costs of this technology adoption itself can be costly. And so we need to think about that when we're saying people should have more flood-resistant varieties and so on. And then finally, individuals, firms can switch sectors, they can switch the products that they're producing. As I already mentioned, they can switch where they are. And so that's adaptation that people take at the individual level. There's also policies that are policies like disaster aid or workfare programs that attempt to, either before a disaster occurs or after a disaster occurs, mitigate largely the income effects of the disaster and help people recover. And again, I want to highlight the fact that many of the policies that we review that help adaptation are not policies where the first order goal was to increase climate change resilience, but they have these core benefits that are important to take into account when we're thinking about the directions of allocation of climate adaptation financing. Great, so what do we know about individual and firm adaptation? So we know that at the individual firm level, firms that have access to capital bounce back faster from natural disasters. So this is a study in Sri Lanka with small firms where the author had a randomized controlled trial, randomly giving capitals to some firms and not others. And what they find is, this is a finding that does not have anything to do with natural disasters, on average, these firms do better. In addition, when there's a natural disaster, they recover faster from it. And so at that moment, it becomes an adaptation technology that is potentially relevant for firms. The other kind of recent work on innovative financial products to help adaptation essentially look at what are some tools that we already have, like credit lines, and how can we perhaps repurpose them into aiding climate change adaptation. And so this study is a randomized controlled trial in Bangladesh, where the author finds that ex ante, before there's any flooding, letting agricultural households know that they have a credit line in event of a disaster like flood helps them smooth out risk before and therefore be more productive, but also if a disaster does occur, it helps them smooth out consumption and therefore helps climate resilience. And so I think this is one recent paper that raises some hope that we can help adaptation with innovative financial technologies, and the take-up of that will be high. And then, of course, as development economists, we put some hope in weather-based index insurance, and I think it holds promise for adaptation in some instances, like the study that I have here. When they are bundled with things like liquidity transfers, they can help farmers take on riskier income streams. In a lot of studies, take-up of weather-based insurance remains low. And so I think trying to understand their role in climate resilience is important moving forward. So in addition to financial technologies, there's technologies and practices. Some of them have been in place for many, many years that households and farmers and firms have used to adapt to just better or worse weather shock, not even for climate change, but now can be helpful in thinking about the climate change adaptation problem. So in agriculture, there's a lot of these technologies. So for example, improved seed varieties can help adaptation to floods. And broadly, we can think about perhaps similar returns being true for things like drought-resistant varieties. And then there's a variety of other agricultural practices. So these can be irrigation technologies, crop diversification, changing the date at which you plant your crops, all hold some promise as adaptive technologies. But there's a couple of things that are pretty important to highlight about the technology adoption for climate resilience in particular. So the study here essentially looks at data from a large number of countries, developing and developed countries. And what they show is that what we think of as adaptive practices, like practices that essentially adapt to rising temperatures, they can also then be risk mitigation technologies, which means that even though they help you do better during a hotter year, they can, on average, help you do worse, unfortunately, during periods when the shocks are not happening. And so for some practices, there are going to be practices that lower the variance of your outcome, but might also lower the mean. And so thinking through which of these technologies might be costly in non-disaster years, and then thinking through whether we want to target the adoption of these technologies in certain areas, at certain time periods. And then finally, when it comes to things like worker productivity, amongst firms, mitigation technologies that actually are lower emission can also help lower the impact of temperature on worker productivity, because in this case, energy efficient lighting dissipates less heat. And so the ambient can actually lower ambient temperature. There's new work that shows that workers take more breaks during hotter times, and that can affect aggregate productivity as well. And so we cite that in the review. And I think another thing that development economists have been studying for a long time and has important insights for technology adoption for climate resilience. And so there's a lot of technologies that seem ex ante, like they should have higher returns, and yet adoption is low. And there's a lot of excellent work in development economics that talks about whether it's because the cost of these technologies are high, whether the cost of adoption are high because there's costly experimentation, or there's issues with learning about the returns. All of these can inhibit the adoption of adaptive technologies. And I think there's rich insights in the literature already that we can draw from when we're trying to increase the adoption of some of these technologies, or at least learn more about why they don't seem to be adopted at a higher rate. Okay, and so given the very large effects of weather shocks and climate shocks on outcomes, the role of policy then becomes, in my opinion, first order. So as I said, policies that focus solely on climate change adaptation are not common, but we can draw lessons from policies that mitigate income shocks in the face of extreme weather. And so some recent work that I think is quite exciting is that interventions that bundle, say, cash transfers, which are directly an income mitigation channel, with, say, training like vocational skills training, can improve resilience in the face of shocks like drought in a way that lasts, so 2 years after the shock. And interestingly, the mechanisms via which they help can work in different ways. So for example, the cash transfers enhances investments in firms, and the skills training allows households to go out and get more work. So it intensifies wage work, urban migration, and so on. And so each of these interventions will work differently in terms of helping adaptation, which I think is a very interesting new study. And then, cash transfers that are announced in advance of an anticipated disaster can minimize losses and support recovery. So again, these are studies that are looking at ex ante before a shock happens, but we can also think about disaster aid ex post. And workfare programs can attenuate the negative effects of temperatures on learning. And this is because the negative effect of temperature on learning is operating largely as a negative income shock. And so when that's mitigated, households are able to keep their children in school. And then finally, other macroeconomic policies that are trying to help poverty reduction, such as the expansion of banking, or they are trying to help health outcomes that are unrelated to climate, like last mile healthcare delivery, can also increase resilience by mitigating the relationship between temperature and mortality. And then, great. So as I said before, there's sort of large potential welfare gains from effective policies. We have some evidence of that already holding promise in terms of increasing resilience, but I think there's a lot more work to be done in this case. So finally, let me take a couple of minutes and review the literature on spatial linkages and adaptation. So as I said before, the effects of climate shocks may be transmitted across regions. And this can be for several reasons. The two primary reasons that we talk about in the review, first are migration responses. So in the face of shock, people might be able to move and lower effects on themselves. And so, these papers are really great in terms of first laying out the spatial effects and then thinking through counterfactual policies on how reducing barriers to migration can improve climate resilience, and also how some of these policies can reduce the impact of climate change, in some cases at a cost to, say, equality. The other reason why the effects of climate shocks might be transmitted across regions is because it might change the sectors in which people work in. So structural transformation might be affected by temperature shocks and rainfall shocks. In work that's sort of recently thinking through this for developing countries, climate change may actually reduce structural transformation, and that's because when agriculture is badly hit, more labor comes into agriculture in case developing countries face the need to have a certain amount of food production. And when you take the cost of that into account, this implies that the costs of climate change are higher than if you ignore this linkage between agriculture and non-agricultural work and the impact of climate on agriculture and non-agricultural productivity. And then finally, the effects of climate shocks can be transmitted via firms' supply chain networks. And that is, the downside of that is that these effects might go in places where climate shocks are not present. As I already pointed out, that might mean that the shocks are mitigated across space as well. And it also then implies that policies that increase climate resilience in one region can then propagate that to other regions. And so the effects of policies then becomes even more important in adaptation. So with that, let me largely conclude. I want to point out that we reviewed a lot of really great papers, and what we can say is that climate change will likely have large aggregate effects on developing countries, including in the fight against poverty, since it directly affects incomes. And that even though individuals and firms and farmers try to adapt on a variety of dimensions, these adaptations can be costly and they seldom provide complete protection. I think thinking about which policies do provide complete protection is a reason for future work. And then finally, as we're thinking about international adaptation financing, how these can be best allocated to regions, to which policies forms a crucial set of questions for future work. So let me pause there, and I look forward to questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much for your presentation, Namrata. Yeah, so we've had some questions which we'll start off with, but if anyone else has any questions that they would like to see are answered, then yeah, put them in the Q&A function on Zoom. The first question we'll go with is from Seneschal, who asks about access to climate information services for farming households and how that might help with agricultural climate adaptation. I guess you maybe partly touched on that, but if there's anything else that you would want to say about that, and I guess I can also pose one more to let you speak for a bit longer. And then Cicero talks about whether there's kind of any evidence on gender differences in adaptation strategies at the individual level, if that's something that there's kind of evidence or has been research on. So I'll leave you with those two for now, but keep the questions coming.
Great, thank you. So I think let me start with a question on access to better information. There is some work that has talked about, and we talk about this in the review, which is the role of forecast information. And so thinking about what weather forecasts can do, for example, to increase resilience. I think the answer is potentially a lot, but it's hard to say because the quality of the information provided also has to be very good. So for example, there's a paper by Mark Rosenzweig and Chris Udry, where they look at the correlation of the monsoon forecast in India and the actual rain that falls in those regions. And they find that that correlation is extremely small, which means that in most regions, farmers are ignoring the information because that's rational for them to do so. So I think information that helps farmers adapt that's high quality is potentially high return. The other place where I think there's room for work is thinking about early disaster responses and letting people know that they should evacuate. So I didn't see much work on this for developing countries, but I think that's A, could be something I don't know, and B, is potentially quite important. I think in terms of the gender breakup of adaptive capacity, so development economists have highlighted how different types of agriculture, which are possibly gendered, are differently vulnerable to weather shock. I think thinking through the implications of how climate change might affect not just the impacts of different types of agriculture, but also the ability to undertake different types of adaptation like migration and how that might vary across gender seems very important to do in future work.
Great, thank you very much. We've had a couple more questions through. One on about firms' adaptation to climate change and whether there's kind of any evidence or been any research about how the size of firm impacts the kind of adaptation strategies that they take. So that's one question that we had, and then a second one that's come through is whether there's been any research. So obviously on the whole, climate change is going to have these negative impacts on developing countries, but there might be certain regions or kind of places that might benefit from raised temperatures, even though on the whole, obviously it's going to be a negative. And the question asks whether there has been kind of any research on that about kind of capitalizing on higher temperatures in places where that might be some sort of benefit rather than a cost.
Sure. So I think the paper that I cited early on that looks at firms and disaster in India talks about how productivity of the firm impacts their adaptation. I think if you look at the literature, there might be, the Zhang et al. Paper might look at effects by firm size as well. In terms of the benefits of climate change, I haven't seen a lot of work on that, largely because, as I said, on average, the impacts in developing countries seem negative. And so there's not been a lot of work that's thinking about how to capitalize potentially warmer temperatures for that. So I think it's great that you guys are asking these questions. I think these 4 comments are already starting to form a nice research agenda. So I hope people are listening about exciting things to work on next.
So a couple more questions. One from Andrew on spatial linkages. He asks if there's kind of any guidance or research that you've found on the type of infrastructure or policy changes that seem like priorities for improving flexibility and climate resilience. So I'll let you go with that one, then I'll ask.
Sure. So I think this is a pretty recent and I think pretty exciting literature. The papers that I talked about in the slides, there's more in the review. Largely the counterfactual policies that they consider are things like migration restrictions, taking down migration restrictions to help adaptation. And I think they find that those are potentially quite promising. I think there's also now work that looks at how physical infrastructure like bridges can help reduce the variability of agricultural incomes, can change the allocation of labor, as well as physical infrastructure like transport infrastructure like railways, and how that affects the propagation of a weather shock into, say, a thing like food reductions and famines, etc. So I think there's work that's looked at physical infrastructure and found that that's quite helpful. There's recent work on spatial linkages that looks at how policies that reduce migration might be able to increase resilience in both seem pretty important.
Great, thanks. We had another question from Andy, who asks whether public and private investments in adaptive capacity should be considered kind of things that complement each other, or whether they're substitutes, and if there's kind of ways in which public investments could be planned to kind of better complement private efforts. Yeah, if that's something that you kind of...
I think it's a really excellent question, and off the top of my head, I don't know. Yeah, I think it's really important to think through. I also, let me throw public-private partnerships in there, which might rely on the private sector to deliver certain aspects of things like construction on time. I don't think we know the effect to which the crowd in or crowd out investments, but again, this could be a feature of my ignorance.
Thanks. Yeah, there's lots of questions coming in, so thanks everyone that's watching and just showing so much interest. Yufan asks whether governments can play a role on overcoming the high costs of climate adaptation, technology adoption, which I think you go over in the lits, especially in terms of kind of the learning and kind of adapting to new technology barriers that people face. So kind of what can governments do in that, and is there anything that non-profits or NGOs could also do to kind of push forward and kind of help reduce the barriers to people kind of adopting new technologies that will help them adapt to climate change?
Sure, yeah. So I think this we extensively sort of review, we include in the review, which is, as I mentioned in the talk, a lot of government policies that are not seeking to help adaptation to climate change, and this is also true for things like transport infrastructure, etc., can help with climate resilience. And so understanding that and having these investments that have these co-benefits, so to speak, will be helpful. I also think that the literature points to something which is quite important, which is that as developing countries grow and develop, you see kind of a natural process of structural transformation, which is labor moving from agriculture to non-agricultural work. And some of the papers that we review find that climate changes over decades, or climate change over decades, can actually hinder these processes of structural transformation, which are fundamental perhaps to the development process itself. And so I think governments trying to facilitate those are also potentially quite helpful, along with some of the earlier, like helping technology adoption, but also understanding that some of these technologies may come with costs themselves. Like they might have lower average return, have lower variability. That's the benefit. Yeah, so I think that I'll sort of stop there, because the message that I think comes out of the work that we looked at is it doesn't even need to be climate resilience to help climate resilience, but things that sort of focus on helping mitigate income responses are potentially quite important. That said, there's a lot of adaptation financing that is hopefully incoming for developing countries, and so hopefully we can think about policies now where the first order explicit objective is to help vulnerable households help and firms adapt.
Thanks so much. A couple more questions. Tom asks about whether there's been any research on the effectiveness of the kind of climate adaptation efforts promoted by external or international development actors. So that's one question. And then another question by Matthew asks about kind of some of the political economy concerns we might have with climate adaptation, and how political economy might interact with different adaptation strategies, and if there's been much work in that area, and if you have any comments.
Yes, thanks. So I think we did not find a lot of work that talks about how international financing can help climate resilience, but I think that's very important when we think about future work, especially because of sort of the direction that we might be going in. I think we do talk a little bit about the political economy of potentially of climate resilience, simply because there is rich work that talks about political economy of everything else in development economics. And what we focused on there is first just talking about how for many other environmental problems, there are political economy concerns like externalities that increase local air pollution. And then when it comes to things like the allocation of disaster aid, when it comes to things like even calling something a disaster or not, there's work that shows that political economy considerations drive that, both in developed and developing countries. And so I think finding overlap between where some of the political economy concerns might align with being able to increase climate resilience is, we think, important. And also finding more ways to feed back voters' preferences into the democratic process will hopefully help that.
Thank you so much for that, Namrata. There's quite a few questions, so I'm not sure we'd get around to all of them, but I'll keep a note of all the questions and I can get back to people separately if we don't get around to them. I guess one question that is probably quite nice to end on by Simone is quite broad, but I'll throw it out to you and then see kind of what you make of it, which is asking what is the way forward that we have drawn from this VoxDevLit in terms of climate adaptation based on the economic research that is covered in the summary.
Yeah, I think the way forward is twofold. The first is to look at policies where prior work has found they're quite effective in increasing climate resilience. And as I said, many of these policies are policies that try to give firms, farmers, and households liquidity in the face of a shock. And think about how increasing climate change, or how much we can extrapolate the effects of these to other regions, to other time periods, etc. And I think the second, which is a lot more diffuse as a direction, but I think very important, is taking some of the raised here by other people on which there isn't great evidence, like what is the role of international development actors? How do we think about political economy? How do we horse race types of infrastructure, or think about public versus private investments and things like that, and try to understand the relative efficacy of this, because I think they are quite pervasive. They have potential as adaptive technologies, and as in the next couple of decades, or then if not sooner, we're going to be faced, or policymakers are going to be faced with hard choices about relative investments into these. So I don't know if that answers your question. I certainly spent a lot of time thinking about how to move forward, but I think what the many excellent papers that we reviewed and the questions from here make me think those are the two directions to push on.
Thank you so much for answering those questions live, Namrata, and also for your amazing presentation. I think we will kind of call it a day there. And as I said, there was quite a few other questions that we weren't able to get around to, but I have a record of them, so I can get back to you on those questions, or send them through to Namrata if we didn't get around to them. Thank you everyone for joining. I've just put a link in the chat to where you can download the full VoxDevLit, and I'll definitely recommend doing that, because obviously by the nature of this presentation, we were only able to cover certain aspects of what is a more detailed, longer survey that might actually answer some of the questions that you had. Be sure to also check out VoxDev's other VoxDevLits. We have now started to get closer to building up our library of these living literature reviews, which summarize the evidence on specific areas of developing economics. And we're looking forward to releasing more VoxDevLits over the coming months, and also to releasing issue 2 of climate adaptation at some point in the future, when some of the questions that were asked today maybe have better research on them moving forward. So thank you everyone for joining. I'm going to end the Zoom now. Thanks again, Namrata.
Thank you for the excellent questions and for staying on. And I just want to say that I view this as kind of being part of the community. So if there's papers we should be looking at or conversations that we should have, I look forward to that. Thanks. Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.